maintenance myths about natives and some tips to keep natives going. We're each going to take 3 minutes to give a quick, good maintenance tip about natives, and then we can have discussion and questions. So first, all the way from Hawaii National Tropical Garden, Heidi
Bornhorst. Thanks for letting me be first, because I can answer all, I can say it all, and I'll be the first to say it, because the resident will say a lot of the same stuff, I'm sure. But in my experience, and I'm going to repeat some of the things I talked about in my talk earlier. In my experience, if you create the similar habitat for the plants to be in, that they will thrive better. Trying to grow a wet forest thing in an area that gets salt spray, and it's not logical, and we'll be struggling all the time. So if you create the environment for the plants and have them growing in a plant community, not just by itself, it makes it easier already. Providing really good soil conditions, starting off by having good soil, good organic soil. You burn forest species and want to replicate the conditions as much as possible. And if you have the good fortune of starting from scratch, start with the very basics and get good soil going first. Good microbial activity in the soil, all that has to be the first thing before you even start to plant anything, or you're going to be feeding yourself from the get-go. Second, the plants that come from the mountains are not necessarily growing in nutrient-rich soil. So if you are going to do any fertilizing, it needs to be slow release stuff. If you overload nitrogen, your acids develop. And then finally, make sure you're planting things that are from the same, the irrigation requirements are similar. If they're not similar and you're not planting them, you're getting enough light, you're getting too much light, you have to think all those things out first. I was thinking of a scenario where I'm planting a coastal like Ojai in the same bedding that's going to have Motta. Well, you're going to have to think about the aspect and everything. The sunniest stuff needs to be on the south-facing side, so it's always in the sun, even if a big tree is growing up behind it, so it doesn't throw it in the shade. You have to know your plants, do your homework, provide the ground conditions that are ideal for it, and then move forward from there, and you'll take care of a lot of, you won't have a lot of problems that you might get if you don't do it right.
Pretty much sums it all. Thanks, everybody. I think from the most experience that I've had with people killing plants is just plain overwatering plants. And it primarily stems from stuff like Ohia lehua, where everybody wants Ohia lehua in their yards, but they're under the assumption that because Ohia today pretty much you only find it with Mulkern, that means it must be a lot of water. No, it doesn't. People often forget that Ohia can also be the first plant to come up after a lava flow. The important thing about Ohia is to me drainage and making sure that you're allowing that water to flow through and let the roots of that plant being able to air out. And the thing about, there's certain plants in the past that have been used a lot in landscaping, native plants, that over the years in the long term haven't been proving themselves successful. And one plant that often comes to mind is Ilima Papa. Ilima Papa is one that, to me, should be used more, like how it was used as much in the past. It's just don't water it as much, because it's going to respond super good to your water, and it's going to love all of that water, and it's going to grow really big and nice and flourish for the first couple of months. But what's happening is it's used to being an environment that is extremely dry. And when given the opportunity, they're opportunistic plants, because they usually come from places that usually don't get regular water. So whenever they are presented with this influx of water, they're going to take it and they're going to take full advantage of it, and they're going to grow nice and big. But what's happening is the plants are getting big, but if you've ever pulled one of those Ilima out, there's hardly any root structure on it, because it doesn't need the roots to support itself, because it's getting ample watering and ample nutrition if you're adding fertilizer to that. Plants that are coastal love that environment, and a lot of our native ground covers come from coastal regions. And so whenever we incorporate native ground covers into landscapes, as much as possible we want to replicate that type of condition. You want to kind of starve your plant. You kind of want to give it and put it in the windiest location possible. You want, like, it doesn't matter if there's a ton of salt spray on a lot of these ground covers because they'll thrive. We've done projects out at that point where nothing was growing because of the conditions of the house. And we put in plants that came in from the point at that house, and the house, the landscape too. So to me, like how Mike was saying, understand the growing conditions of the plant, understand the area that you're putting the plant in, and try and replicate that. And don't be afraid to not water. And don't be afraid of the elements, because certain plants thrive in the harsh conditions.
I would add that if the plant's still in a pot though, you have to water down.
Oh.
Just saying, because sometimes you tell people it's drought tolerant, and they say, oh, righteous, I never need to water, right? One of my big ones is, and we all learned this in school, but we forget that, right down. We see plants and we're shooting what's wrong, and you go through all the hydraulic things. But if you look and look for the root flare and look for where the trunk was, so often too deep. And some die instantly, and some have a slow death. And again, I said it in my talk, prepare your soil, good drainage. Most natives from any habitat have good drainage. And if you're managing a landscape, keep the trucks off, keep the bulldozers off. Don't let the construction workers park under the shade tree or park on pavement. That's where it belongs. With trees, you don't see the damage right away. 4 years later, the tree dies, and again, they tell you, oh, it dies. Natives are so sensitive. And I'm going to turn it over to my next expert, an amazing landscape architect. Very quick.
And I'm just going to pass it on to thank you. To me, one of the I'm going to agree with Kevin. Kevin's been right all along. Native plants are not landscape plants. Endemic native plants. And so one thing I would want to convey is don't treat native plants as if they're substitutes for exotic landscape plants in the landscape. That you're going to trim them, that you're going to manage them as if they were typical landscape plants that we use, typical non-native landscape plants. They have a different aesthetic, they have a different sense of beauty, and a different kind of natural setting. We can't expect to use endemic native plants as substitutes for exotic landscape plants in an exotic landscape, and expect to be happy with that. The native plants are not going to be happy being treated that way, because as the panel has suggested, they're going to get overwatered, they're going to get over-fertilized, they're going to get over-managed, and they're going to fail. And so accept a different aesthetic, something I think is more appropriate aesthetic, something that's truly a Hawaiian aesthetic in terms of the landscape beauty, and accept that. It's going to look different than the manicured landscape.
With regards to maintenance, I've gotten to a point where it seems to me that the maintenance of native plants are not that much different than any landscape plant. There's plants that like a little more water, but less water, that tolerate pruning. Some of the, when we use, I got my cheat sheet, otherwise I'm going to get way off track. But some of the native plants that we use are Alpaca, Micheal, Vitex, Stilo, Nanu. We use them not so much because they're natives, but because they're just tough landscape plants. And when I present them to the customers, I often don't say native, I just say these are plants that are successful. some of you have heard me speak out occasionally, kind of maybe not in a positive way about natives, and I wanted to try to rebrand myself and kind of clarify things. I was up in Waihiwa yesterday, coming back from small claims court. A welder didn't perform. I didn't like the idea that he took $2,000 from me, didn't perform. So I got a judgment against him. As I was driving back, I realized 20 years ago, I was upset about the oleander planted in the medial strip in the freeway that was being attacked by weed whackers. I think 20 years later, the oleander is still being replanted. There were armies of people hand-weeding the native grasses, and as I came down close to Coral City, there was something called silver gazania that lasted about 2 years and died. And then across from Leader Community College, there was portulaca. And so my anger at times about natives is not when it's used in a private landscape or at Punahou School, because I think there's a place for the resort where there's a trained maintenance staff and there's an ongoing maintenance budget. But my anger is when my tax monies are used for large public landscapes, sometimes put in, I think, to benefit a politician who wants to say, I'm native, I'm not Hawaiians. But in fact, he's taking money from Hawaiian homes, Hawaiian education, from Hawaiian healthcare, and putting it into something that makes it look good, that may only last, let's say, a year, and then it's gone. And nobody realizes that the naturalized landscape, and this is where I want to give Steve Dacus, Chris Dacus, thank you, dyslexia in my cheat sheet, but he's been advocating something called naturalized landscapes. And if you go to my Facebook page, which my daughter kind of helps me with, there's a picture of me at Diamond Head showing me with my surfboard and a naturalized native landscape. Basically, there's weeds about 3 feet tall around me, but that's something our taxpayer dollars were used. And what I like most about the discussions today is there's been a lot of talk about maintenance. So it's not really about whether it's a portulaca or a native plant or an exotic, but you need to talk to the gardener or the homeowner who's going to be taking care of it before you make any planting decisions. If it's going to be maintained with a weed whacker and there's not going to be a functioning irrigation system, you can't go taking federal dollars and saying, well, we're going to use this $4 million to plant native plants because the money's there, and well, it's regrettable, but there's no irrigation system, there's no maintenance budget, and so obviously any landscape, whether it be natives or other, would perish. So we as an industry, I think, need to kind of say, well, we can't take that money to plant natives, we can't take that money to plant any landscape plant that we can't care for.
Thank you. I think many of us in the industry would agree with that. We follow the rules, we plant things, we maintain it to the 90-day industry standard, and then, we've all seen it. And one thing this conference is to try and bring all the good minds together and the hardworking people who do it every day of their life. So does anyone in the audience have anything they would like to share? Sorry, this one doesn't travel, but come up and talk to us. Please, Erin.
I was just wondering if there are any special considerations for plantings as the plants get established for native plants that would be different from how to treat other plants, irrigation or other
One thing, we talk about xeriscapes. We've been advocating xeriscapes for, I don't know, 20 years or so now, ahead of when we're going to really run out. And you tell people, water it till it's established, and then back off. And it's really hard to make a formula or an exact thing, I think, anywhere, but especially in Hawaii. We're so diverse. Our little micro habitats, our soil type. So often, it's a really well-trained maintenance person who takes a good landscape architect design, who takes awesome native plants, and really looks at that garden, homeowner too, and makes the judgment call about how much water. Fine tune, we all learn it in college or when we go to a conference. In the winter, even in Hawaii, you dial back your automatic system or you water less. But it's that trained, optimized, the maintenance person, homeowner, condo association, what have you. And I think we have other people to comment on that one. Water is super important.
Most of the time, it's like I said earlier, it's just too much water. And so we've done projects where, you take the hottest spot on Oahu, which is actually out at Kalaeloa, and you get 4 inches of soil. We put in irrigation for restoration projects, and we run the irrigation for about a month, where for the first week we water every day. Second week we cut that in half. Third week we cut that in half. Fourth week, after that we shut it off. And the plants are still there today because they've acclimated to a point where that's how they are. We've got multiple generations of plants that come off of it. In the landscape, depending, and Mike was alluding to this, is the community of plants that we plant together with those communities, assuring that they all can have that same requirement. Trees, for example, a few trees need a lot of watering once you have them planted and established in the ground. My rule is, and I think I got this from your book, where once you see active growth on the plant, start cutting it back. And cut it back to the point where you no longer see it stressing, shut it off. And usually, plants really respond to that. And in the long run, if for whatever reason there's an extended period of drought, then water it again if you need to. But for the most part, understanding the plant's natural conditions of where they thrive best is what's most important. So before you even do any type of planting, I would either seek advice from a consultant or a landscape architect and proceed from there.
With regards to the Diamond Head project, one of the reasons that project failed is the irrigation, once it was set, was never reduced. So when I go surfing there at 6 o'clock in the evening, the sprinklers would be on. They were on a very long duration when the planting was first put in, and a year or two later, even after the planting kind of faded, it was still on at 6 o'clock. So reducing the water would have done a lot of good for that. And for those of you who are driving back to Pearl City tonight, one successful native planting is kind of by the Middle Street overpass where Vitex and Alpaca were used on the freeway. As I was driving back yesterday, kind of happy about my win in small claims court, there was a section where I think the irrigation system failed on the Motta side of that planting, which I think was a good thing, because in Alpaca, although it had smaller leaves and wasn't as dense, it had reached a size that covered the hillside, and it looked quite attractive, where on the ocean side, I think some of the Naupaka was being watered for residential properties on the perimeter of the freeway, and the water running down is causing the Naupaka to get a lot bigger than it really needs to be, and it's going to create a maintenance problem. So, going back and just, playing with the water a little bit can save you a lot of time and reduce leakage.
In regards to the Diamond Head project that Kevin was talking about, that project ended up being a large waste of money because it failed. But the original funding for that project wasn't from taxpayer dollars. It was actually privately funded. And part of me is actually happy that it failed because it was the wrong plant. It was a large area that was planted, and the plant that they used as the primary ground cover was this plant called Niopapa. And actually, Nile Papa is a made-up name, but we made it up because it's a Nile that's prostrate, and like an Ilima Papa, you would call, it's a prostrate Ilima. In our nursery, we just started calling it Nile Papa. And we felt it suitable because the name prior to that was Dwarf Nile, excuse me. And I didn't like saying Dwarf Nile, so we just we made up the name Nile Papa. Nile Papa only grows naturally in a very small portion of the Big Island, near South Point. And the fact that it was used so extensively along that coastline, to me, was a problem because it was such a natural area that you should have used the Nile that would have been from that coastline, from Oahu at least, or at least the southern coast of Oahu. And the main reason why it died, I was actually there when it happened, was, for one thing, it was being overwatered, but it was affecting the Nile to a point that it was getting very big and large, but if you have the space for that plant to do that, then awesome. But when you use Nile Papa specifically in a landscape where you need to maintain it into a certain planting bed, I would never use Nile Papa for that. And you won't hear this from me often, but I do not like to use Nile Papa in a landscaping project, unless there is a large area that needs to be covered. But the main reason why that plant died was because of the excess water that was being added allowed a lot of the guinea grass to grow up. And there was actually a prison crew came down and was working with the city to go and clear out all of the guinea grass that was popping up. And they just never saw the Nile Papa that was growing under there. And literally, when I drove by, there was a mountain of guinea grass and Nile Papa that got ripped out. So I actually asked the supervisor that was there if I could come back tomorrow to collect all of the Nile Papa out of the pile, and he agreed to do that. But ever since then, it never grew back. Another failed native planting that I've seen, again, it didn't have anything to do with the plant. It had everything to do with the landscaping company that installed the plant. And we grew out, this is for the Makapulu Lighthouse area when they built the parking lot. They built the parking lot, but they closed it even though the parking lot was completed and the landscaping was completed. The landscaping extended all the way alongside parallel to Kalaniao Ole Highway. And we were the guys that grew the plants out. And the landscaping company that was doing the installation told us to bring all the plants and just nonstop, they're planting them as fast as we can bring them. Just keep on delivering them. There are thousands and thousands of plants. We delivered all the way up until 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. And nobody worked Saturday or Sunday or the following Monday because it was a holiday. And all of the plants were left on the asphalt with no water. And then they installed the plants, whatever was alive, the following Monday. And on the plants, they were supposed to put in a temporary irrigation system. Their temporary irrigation system was a watering truck that just shot water out of the side of the truck onto soil that was freshly deposited on top of an old layer of compacted soil. So of course, all of the water, all of the soil ran off and exposed all of the roots. But the biggest problem was along that entire stretch of Kalaniao Ole Highway, where all of the akuli were planted. They never barricaded that area off, and the parking lot was closed. And there was hundreds of people that go there on the weekend, so where did they park? On top of the akuli green. It was the most frustrating weekend ever. But what gets the blame? The plants. And it is totally not the plant's fault. It is 2,000% the contractor's fault. So I just had to say that because that project frustrated the hell out of me because I tried my best to get not only the plant material ready, but we actually had to change the specs of the plants because the original native plants that were going in weren't from that coastline. So we tried our best to get in Nayo and to get in Ma'o, which well represented the Canadian coastline. And that's what happened. Wait.
I feel your pain.
Yeah.
All of this brings up one of our best common epic native plants. Surfers love it, divers love it. Naupaka Kapakai, beach Naupaka. It's common, it's easy to grow, but it is such an abused plant. Overwatered, over fertilized, brutalized with equipment.
It's the worst thing you can do for an alpaca.
When kind of what we're all saying here, plant it, establish it, back off the water. Don't fertilize it. Back off the water all the way. When it's used at a resort, we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it in highways. We're seeing it in medians. And it would be the right plan if they could just, but it's really hard to write that into a spec. Feeling the pain of landscape architects. Nowadays we get specs. So many trees were killed to make this spec. I'm full of them in my office. But who reads that? There's a couple landscape architects that are super awesome that would read all that, but the inspectors don't read it. And I would say all of us, you know, they told us with computers that was going to go paperless, but instead it generates way more paper. And we all know, nobody reads anymore, they just do this. So I would say make, and often I see specs from landscape architects that is a cut and paste from the mainland. Like they're saying, when it's snowing, when it's frost, and they should go out and delete that language. But beach no pop up, no water, no fertilizer, and if it must be trimmed, use that old technique called flippers. Anyone from the audience? We're kind of dominating just because we have the mic. Pardon?
Any questions? Native planting questions?
I had one. What I've noticed is we did a native planting at the Marine Base, and you helped a lot with the plants. We came and took over a failed planting and ended up maintaining it for a year. It was about almost half a mile long. It had those native sedges, it had Nayo, it had Naupaka, it had some both trees and stuff. And then I was talking to the supervisory people and saying, so what are you going to do when the irrigation comes out and stops weeding? Because it took like 40 man-hours a week to keep it weeded out. And they weren't sure. And look, I came back like a year later and looked, and it was all dead. And I don't know how much it cost to put in because I came in later on. But I think the common thing I've seen is that, and this is true for non-native plantings too, is that the authorities that are engaging this work do not understand the follow-on necessities. And the people that are writing the spec and designing the plants and choosing the plants, even if they choose the correct plants, if they haven't designed it with the amount of maintenance and the kind of maintenance it's actually going to get in mind, then it's not going to survive. So I think we have more of a social and economic problem than we have a native plant problem.
Boy, and reading the program, I think you were supposed to be up here.
I came late.
Okay, a couple of things that were mentioned, with regards to the prison inmates working at Diamond Head. I think the way they handled the grass was with a weed whacker, and I have great difficulty getting my men to use a weeder, to pull out weeds and to explain to them that they need to get the roots, they can't break out the tops. But I think in selecting the plant, although weeding ground cover, so if done properly, is a lot less maintenance than weed whacking and mowing. Finding a person that understands the value of pulling out the weed when it just gets started is difficult. I think in controlling grasses, we use a lot of fusilade, or a little bit of fusilade, which it seems to be fairly effective at controlling grasses and ornamental ground covers. But the risk of having someone look at a person wearing gloves or a respirator or a jumpsuit or just spraying a chemical causes a lot of people to freak out. And the amount of time you explain to the general public that the product is relatively safe, you've screened out the area and when it's dried, so finding plants that can be maintained kind of by the maintenance contractors is challenging. And pruning, although sounds very easy, gas-powered shears seem to empower young men and even people my age. I mean, they give me a chainsaw, and I'm in heaven, but a pruner, whenever I sharpen it, I always trim a piece of my finger off. So, the pruning is easy, but you've really got to be realistic about who is going to maintain it and what they're actually going to do.
I'll just add one more thing about water, which is really a critical issue because it affects so many things with the plant, including the weeds that grow up the plant. As you cut back water, I think you should water more deeply. And, so you encourage deeper root growth and you encourage a moisture reserve in the soil that is lower down and carry the plant to it.
Speaking of excellent landscape architects who read all the specs, that's I was looking at you, Janet Gilmore.
Yes, regarding mulch, I think most of us know that mulch generally is good with a few caveats like, keep it away from the orchards and the trees and fruit shrubs and such. But what about different types of mulch, in different conditions? Because I've been heard lately of some experiments where it is the mainland where they find different mulches do different things. Also, bug control too, which relates to the bee friendliness and all too. So anyway.
All for that excellent question. And since I have the mic, I'll answer first. Stone mulch, Pohaka mulch, is so excellent in Hawaii. It looks good, it repels slugs, it persists when our organic mulches don't always. And often, when you're working with a contractor, they're digging up stuff and raking up and throwing away all the rocks. And it hurts me to see that because those rocks are valuable. They're good for drainage, they're part of the natural soil. And I always say, those rocks belong to us, please don't haul them away. Leafy mulch, and Rick alluded to this a lot. Leaves are gold, leave the leaves, let them fall. Train your mind to that aesthetic, that you're going to build up your good soil over time. People in Hawaii were into clean it up, get rid of it, get rid of it. And I have a silly little thing about it, that trees don't make rubbish, people do. But training people that, you don't want anything they're going to slip on or hurt themselves. But if it's onto the soil, leafy mulch is really good. And grinding up our tree waste, like people used to say, we were getting a lot of green waste from tree trimmers at Ho'omolokia where our soil was terrible. And a lot of the guys said, we don't want any of that coconut waste. Coconut is junk. And my counter to that was if the chipper is sharp and they're shredding the coconut really well, coconut mulch is excellent. We had lolu palms that sat there in the red dirt straight, doing nothing for years. And then when we put that mixed coconut mulch on them, suddenly they found their way. And I think that is some really interesting research. We can do it in our own landscapes, seeing what kind of mulch we're using and reporting it. But I like that different, like I went to a talk about a local chocolate maker yesterday, and he was saying what excellent mulch the parchment on the cocoa is. If we can get enough people growing chocolate, it's really good mulch, not to mention good, not native. Be like, I'm going on too long. Anyone else? Mulch stuff?
Just got to make a comment about the coconut mulch. It's one of my favorite mulches to use. I think that's good. It's weed seed free, pH neutral, and it lasts kind of long. And it's just really good stuff. So they can send it all to Hawaii if they want. I'm happy to take it. What I like using stone mulch is pretty good because of the reasons that you said. But I take wood chip from tree trimmers in our area as well. The only thing that makes me nervous about it is what kind of chips are there, because some trees do have a lutepathia, and I need to mulch around the bare plants with material that might be releasing toxins into the soil. So that's the only thing about it. Otherwise, if I know what the wood chip is made of, it's my preferred thing to use, even though we have a million wild chickens on Hawaii that likes to kick it around, simply because it's the organic recycling. It is building the soil profile and it's slowly releasing nutrients as well. So, I live and die by how much mulch. I've also, when I first started at SBG, they used to have a big Pachari collection, and they used to pretty generally herbicide around the trees just to keep the grass and the weeds away from the Pacharias. And the way I eliminated all that spraying was to grind all of our green waste on a regular schedule, as long as we could afford to, and mulch it twice a year, to 4 to 6 inches, and we completely eliminated herbicide spraying around our Pachari collection. And the trees have responded. The soil is much better now. It's not compacted or funky looking like it was after we put too much glyphosate on it.
I also use coarse mulch in planter beds that are more, dry forest and mesic forest type plantings. But what I really like to use in lieu of that is if I'm trying to replicate a coastal garden. Even though we plant the plants into the soil, I often like to cap it with either crushed coral or even man sand, like crushed coral that's all the way down to the sand grade. And in addition to providing a uniformity, as the water percolates through it, it adds some of that basicness to the soil that a lot of the coastal plants prefer. The only problem with using sand is that you make a big kitty litter box. So I try to keep it to just crushed cocoa chips, 3/4 inch or smaller, and it really the coastal plants really respond well to it. Even though you're planted in a straight soil, a lot of times people try and compensate that red dirt with adding lime to the soil or whatever. Just cap it with crushed coral.
And here we have Lila Biano.
Here, related to the stone mulch, I've been doing tests on, there's this product called termite block, which is actually a basalt product that they put as a sub-base under foundations of new construction to prevent ground termites from coming up. But that grade of basalt, it's coarser than man sand, which is not good for planting because it compacts, it's too fine, and it gets really like cement. But when you have a coarser grain basalt mulch or mix it in, if the landscape industry can lobby the quarry to make a kind of a larger size grain to the basalt crusher, the soil structure can be really improved. It's long lasting. It adds minerals really slowly back into the soil, like the green sand or those kind of mainland mineral amendments that they put in. But it adds a lot to the soil structure. It's long lasting. It's durable, and you can amend with other mulches, and then yeah, it's just a wonderful product. And you can talk to us with it too. But yeah, it'll reduce maintenance and it'll increase the vigor of the plants over time.
I also really like monkey pod. Monkey pod, leaves, seed pods, flowers. You know, people rake it up, clean it up. That is the best mulch. And then sometimes people will say, oh, but you know, all the seedlings sprout up. And I'm like, that's a good thing. Weed them up quickly and use them for green mulching. Let's win them. Make your aliens work for you. And you know what, we're gonna take one more question or comment and then everyone gets out of school early. And we can go and take this conversation outside. Some people need to get back to work. So one more very succinct, good comment. Succinct now, yeah.
I have a background in soil. I don't know if I need this, but so I have a background in soils, and soil really can use the organic matter. What happens is the microbes go after that to build their bodies, and they make proteins, and those proteins line the openings that they create when they're going to pursue another organism for food. Well, they eat the organic matter, but they also eat each other, and those bodies actually line those pores with their proteins, and then the soil becomes spongy because it's actually lined with little pores. And what you want is a pore size distribution, and that's what the mulch will provide. It'll allow these soils that we have here, which are primarily clay. The sand that we have here is beach sand, or it's actually coral, for shells. We don't have any really quartz sand here, and so we don't have that as a component. We can add it and add these sand when we need it for the plants. But what we can do is we can aggregate these clays that we have. Now, there's a big difference between the red soil and the black soil. The red soil is a wonderful soil to have because those things, those clay particles have been cemented into what we call pseudo-sands. And inside these particles that are cemented with the aluminum and iron oxides, there's little tiny pores. And we like that. So when we make these things with organic matter from the microorganisms, we have these little tiny claws, and inside there are tiny pores. And then there's other things. So we want to build soil structure by using organic matter. And the best way is just put it on the surface, and it'll go into the soil. The microbes will. If you mix it, it'll burn it quicker, and you'll get less value out of it. So
I've worked with a variety of architects and have some huge books as far as maintenance specs and regulations, but I think the state excels and the city does an even better job. Some of you may not be aware of it, but Chris Dacus actually implemented a pilot program about 2 years ago where I guess someone similar to a CLT or an arborist or a person with horticultural skills would be overseeing the maintenance of the state projects. And this is really important because when you have great specs, the maintenance contractor can interpret it and the state inspector can interpret it. It doesn't do a lot of good. So our neighborhood board, like the Cuyo Kalani neighborhood board, actually acknowledged him for the great work the pilot program did on Kalani Highway. And whether it be exotic plants, such as the ones used on Kalani Highway, or the native plantings, we need to have skilled inspectors making sure that the specs are followed. So I want to thank Chris for that project.
So we're going to wrap it up now, and want to thank our amazing panel
And our moderator.
and all of you.